Sean Connor. I am the Executive Director of the International Peace Bureau. We're very happy to continue our work for peace on Ukraine, although we wish we wouldn't have to, that the war would already be at an end and that we would see peace. Unfortunately, that not being the case, and now 2 years into the war, I think a lot of us are continuing to question how long will this war go on? Is there any end in sight? And with the deteriorating geopolitical situation that we're seeing around the world, I think many of us also have quite strong fears and doubts about the continued militarization that we're seeing around us, the explosion of new wars and new fronts and new tensions around the world, and desperately hope to find answers to this. So that is why we are here today. We have 3 sessions developed over the course of today, each one consisting of around 1 hour in time. Our first session is looking at these larger geopolitical changes that we're seeing in the world, as well as the humanitarian costs, specifically in the context of Ukraine, seeing what developments are happening in the world, in the war from a peace perspective. And to that end, we have a number of really great speakers with us today. Unfortunately, our first speaker for the session is not with us at the moment. I believe there are some technical difficulties there. We will be trying to bring him online to speak. But while we are working on that, in the meantime, I'll provide a brief overview of the sessions that we're doing today and of some of these geostrategic changes that we are seeing. So the first session, as I said, this is our focus, looking at 2 years into the war. Are we in a war of attrition? What are the consequences of continued warfare? And then we look into the ways out in session 2. And this is looking at all of the peace proposals that have been put on the table over the past 2 years, seeing if there's still any hope in any of these arrangements, looking also at the Zelensky peace plan, and looking at the role of the Global South. And then in the final 3rd session, we will have the opportunity, all of you as well, to join in the conversation and together brainstorm solutions and the continued role of civil society 2 years in. As many of you know and have been participating in, IPB and our partners around the world have been organizing a number of activities around Ukraine, from the International Summit for Peace in Ukraine in June of last year and the Week of Action in the end of September and beginning of October. And we are hoping to continue this, but as always, we think this is not an effort specifically of any one organization, but for all of us to work together and find solutions, find ways that we can work to bring peace to Ukraine. So thank you so much for being with us. In light of that, just briefly to say, we are seeing attention shifting on one hand, whether it be because of the war in Gaza or other geopolitical tensions around the South China Sea, in the Asia-Pacific region. We're seeing fatigue from many Western nations and a stalemate on the battlefield in Ukraine. These changes are bringing people to ask questions that maybe they weren't asking earlier in the war. It's bringing new people into the question of peace as well, as we see quite contradictory points of view of Western governments when it comes to different wars and different actors, different interpretations of international law, and of course the continued war on the ground, the violence that continues in Ukraine. So I won't go too into depth. I'm hoping our speaker will join in a minute, but in lieu of that, I'll turn the floor over to our moderator for the first session, Hans-Peter Degischer, who will introduce the rest of the speakers and give them the floor.
Hello. I'm talking from Vienna. I'm from the member of the Austrian Alliance on Peace and Neutrality. Yesterday, we went to the OECD session of the parliamentary meeting and passed them the Vienna Peace Declaration. I don't know if really discussed it, but anyhow, we passed it over to some delegates. So originally, I studied physics, but I'm now retired for some time and engaged in this peace movement. So as Michael Schoenberg is not present, can we start with Heidi Meinzolt? Is it possible for you, Heidi, to start on the
Of course.
humanitarian and psychological consequences of this warfare?
Mm-hmm. Just to present a little bit myself, I was in the Vienna Peace Conference as one of the participants, and my organization, WILF, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, supported this conference against a lot of handicaps, and we are still, as WILF is the oldest women's peace organization, we put a lot of emphasis on the human dimension of violence in a broad sense. And of course, war is one of the most horrible stories of violence. It is really a heavy and a very sad day, this 24th of February. And I think the first thing I have to say is I joined the desperation of so many women and children and people as such exposed to terrible violence, to the destruction of their lives, the loss of home, of property, of friends, families, and all what made their life viable. I can sometimes imagine the alarms waking them up in the middle of the night. And I hear a lot of stories. And I remember with these stories of especially also the women, I strongly remember the cries of the women in black in the Balkans, where sexual violence was massively used as a weapon of war, and where healing procedures are ongoing since 30 years. And in addition, tensions, political tensions, social disaster are still their reality and even growing. And yeah, I remember also the stories of my grandmothers who long time did not talk about what happened in the war. And as a member of WILF, I hear Leader Gustava Heimann, one of the founding members, said in 1915, women can never be protected in war. And she made an appeal to the people at this time in Europe not to let this war go on. So there is a long commitment behind. At the same time, coming back to Ukraine, I remember that there are so many encouraging pictures also from Ukraine of ongoing school in shelters, cooking in metro stations, feminist solidarity, also on the logistic level, defense of the Istanbul Convention, the documentation of war crimes. There is a lot of positive energy going on. And I see also in my German neighborhood, the children trying to adapt to where they live now and survive in their forced exile. The women with whom we speak here also, who don't know if they would ever return. At least those who have found a job, a decent life here, and fear partners who have gone willingly or unwillingly through terrible experiences with war and violence. And war is terrible from a human perspective, and this is much more than a political view on geostrategy. They are these traumatized and injured men serving totally exhausted in the army or being under permanent threat of recruitment against their will, the discreditation and the criminalization of consciousness objectors and their supporters. You all know also the example of Olga Karach from Belarus, who is really under threat because of this support. And we see these articles on the horror of the war are coming closer, also in our media. And nearly absent of the discussion is instead the investment in healing the trauma and investing more in the social and ecological consequences under ongoing war. And I really see this as one of the biggest problem. What will be the future of such a country with a completely destroyed infrastructure in a poisoned land for agricultural production and the trauma of the people? Yeah, are people resisting, believing in victory? Are they heroes? Where does us patriotism lead? And where does the priority to always heavier weapons lead us? And where is the turning point also for Ukrainians to lose hope? These are all very burning questions, and we all have more questions than answers. Solidarity, networking, creating space for dialogue is needed, and this is the most important need from a human and humanitarian point of view. But as women, as peace builders, we have also an additional responsibility. We need to strengthen us mutually to talk about ending the war, organizing pathways to peace, as we did also in Vienna, invest in niches of this peace building to encourage and request diplomacy on all levels. And we must not abandon disarmament as a fundamental principle of solving conflicts. Disarmament does not only concern weapons, but this is a strong conviction to believe in justice, in chances for non-violent conflict solution, in trainings, in peace education. And we need investments starting from our brain to the concrete budgets. As my colleagues in Austria, for example, request a higher budget for civilian conflict solution, and even with the vision of a peace ministry. Yeah, in this actual narrow focus on weaponry, I see a high risk, even in the peace movement, in my old women's peace organization, a high risk in this important discussions going around feminist foreign policy to talk still about disarmament. And I think we contribute building islands for peace and justice with the people affected most by the war, the violence and the injustice. And we have to promote positive neighborhoods and cross-border dialogues. I know that this is extremely difficult, and there is a need of enormous courage, like Owen, for example, in Berlin, do it, trust building since many years, but now also coming back to first discuss within the communities what they can offer to come together again. But this is so needed. We oppose, and we have to continue to oppose profit and privileges of warfare. And we emphasize on prevention in all conflict levels. It's a heavy task because, for example, the public discourse, also in my country, in Germany, completely changed. We call it times have changed. But I have to say, and I come to an end, on this day of commemoration of 2 years of this war, independently of what Jean mentioned to the other wars going around, we refuse the normalization of war. And we insist that pacifism is not, as our chancellor in Germany said, the devil, but an active commitment in a broader peace perspective. Militarism is shifting the budgetary priorities away from care and canceling and discrediting peace conferences, discussing the pathways to peace, including disarmament initiatives, diplomacy, ceasefires, is a risk also for internal peace of our societies and in the values that we pretend always to defend. At the end, I would say we need to go on as peace activists. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you very much on this appeal. And I think we could go on with Joseph Gerson, who is an American peace activist and president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, Common Security. And please join in with your talk.
Thank you.
Discussion afterwards, yes, Heidi.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to see a number of older and new friends, even in this difficult time. I've been asked to speak about what we should expect of the war a year from now. And I need to begin by saying I don't have a crystal ball, and I can't promise to accurately predict where we'll be a year from today. And perhaps the further away we are from the war, the less we know. 3 things that we do know are that Russia will continue fighting until it secures Ukrainian neutrality, and it will resort to any means necessary to prevent what U.S. General Austin has stated as the U.S. goal, which is winning Russia's strategic defeat. Second, recently reforged Ukrainian nationalism will be resisting Russian domination then and for years to come in whatever form. And as was the case before Russia's invasion, Ukraine will have no chance of joining NATO. Let me begin by saying that if Ukraine continues to reject neutrality and ceasefire negotiations, it jeopardizes its great 2022 victories and the future sovereignty of Ukraine. While we can't discount the influence of Putin's ambition to restore the Russian Empire, before the Russian invasion, then during the Istanbul negotiations, and with diplomacy now, there have always been the possibilities to guarantee a secure, neutral, and sovereign buffer state in Ukraine, albeit with about 18% less of its 1991 boundaries. That's what we can hope for a year from now. It's worth noting that prior to Russia's invasion, many in the Ukrainian Western-oriented elite would have been happy to see much of Russian-speaking and oriented Eastern Ukraine secede. it would have left a more ethnically homogeneous Western Ukraine to pursue its ambitions with the EU and the West. Putin's invasion, counterproductively, has consolidated a revised version of Ukrainian nationalism, which is self-defeatingly insisting on the conquest of the more Russian-oriented territories under Kiev's control. What will we see in a year? We could be in the first stages of a Trump dictatorship, with accommodations being made to Moscow at Ukrainian expense. Other dimensions of that dictatorship would include implementing plans for U.S. military mobilization to deport hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of immigrants from the United States. The current fragile détente with China would be a memory, as Trump ratchets up his racist military and economic confrontation with China. Policies and diplomacy designed to halt and reverse the climate emergency would be similarly shredded. And the liberty, human rights, and processes ostensibly guaranteed by our flawed constitution here would be in serious jeopardy, if not deposited into the dustpan of history. These would not be Ukrainian events, but they would certainly impact the war's geopolitical context. On the other hand, fear of dictatorship here could lead to Biden's reelection and the continued rule of what has become the Democratic War Party. In such case, weapons and treasure from the U.S. would again be deluging Ukraine and its increasingly divided political and military leadership. That division, of course, is a function of the war not going as they had hoped. Almost a year ago, General Milley announced that the Ukraine war was stalemated and that neither side could obtain a military victory. General Austin has yet to rescind his statement that the U.S. NATO goal is strategic defeat of Russia. That goal is unachievable, but in the absence of ceasefire and diplomacy, it continues to be pursued by the United States. Here in the U.S., much of our media is broadcasting that in the absence of renewed weapons supplies to Ukraine, it faces defeat, and that the Balkans the Baltics and Poland face possible Russian invasions. That won't be happening. 95% of Russian conventional forces are now tied down in Ukraine, and to conquer Ukraine, the Russian military would have to engage in massively more difficult urban warfare at perilous cost to its forces. It has been reported that even to take Avdiivka, Russia lost 1,000 troops a day, not a sustainable way to fight a war. And with its conventional military capacities not approaching what it was expected of a superpower, its arsenal running low, and with Finnish and Swedish integration into NATO, even without formal Swedish ascendancy, Russia will be focusing on rebuilding its conventional forces and concentrating on a defensive strategy in relationship to NATO for the next decade or more. And while in the near term, Russian economic and diplomatic dependence remains on China remains essential for Moscow, being its junior partner will be less appealing for the longer run. With its sparse population and lack of economic development in eastern Siberia, Moscow's hold over what was formerly Chinese territory is less than secure. Moscow may prove to have greater fish to fry than launching a catastrophic war against NATO, even if Trump's American firsters withhold their support for Europe. What else might we see? In all probability, Ukraine and Russia will still be at war even in the first months of a possible Trump rule. In such case, as we see from recent commitments made by Britain, France, and Germany, European support for Ukraine would be significantly increased to support what of necessity is becoming Ukraine's defensive war. In any case, it seems that subservient congressional Republicans here will continue to kowtow to Trump, depriving Ukraine of U.S. weapons and financial support, and increasing the burden on Europe to support Kiev. Two major contingencies should not be ruled out. As we've seen since the beginning of the war, there remains the possibility of horizontal or vertical escalation in a desperate effort to break the stalemate, or in response to an unexpected breakthrough on one side or the other. In this situation, incidents unintended or manufactured by one party or the other remain a possibility, with Russia especially concerned about Kaliningrad and aggressive forces in Poland. There also remains the possibility of Kiev responding to Russia's renewed offensive by acquiring and launching longer range and more devastating missiles against Russia itself, which in turn would precipitate a still more dangerous and difficult escalation spiral. Excuse me for reading, but it's just after 7 o'clock in the morning here. Former president and now deputy head of Putin's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, appears to be addicted to the U.S. playbook for preparing and threatening nuclear attacks amidst international crises and wars. His repeated nuclear threats have helped to unleash increasing numbers of calls from the Russian media and even the Russian parliament to end the nagging special military operation, which continues, and to respond to it, to end it immediately with terrorizing nuclear attacks. We can hope that a year from now, this will not have led us across the nuclear threshold. There's another question about Ukrainian unity. The fantasy of reconquering 18% of 1991 Ukraine, currently held, that 18% currently held by Russia, still has powerful hold on the people in the rest of Ukraine. But some in the elite are recognizing the stalemate, and this has unsettled Zelensky. He just fired Army Chief Zaluzhny, who had named the stalemate and was reportedly engaged in back-channel explorations with the Russian military to bring the war to a mutually beneficial end. These are the reasons that he was ousted. It's not just because the military was on the defensive. Zelensky has also had to retreat from his plans to augment his exhausted and depleted army by drafting another 50,000 civilians for the war. Apparently, few are willing to be the last man or woman to die for 18% of historic Ukraine, and this will still be the case as we enter 2025. In such circumstances, especially if Ukrainian forces suffer shocking battle losses, the Ukraine elite, including among some in the military, may see the writing on the wall and replace Zelensky to pursue negotiations for a neutral state with the possibility still of EU membership. There is more to the war than centuries of Russian-Ukrainian tensions. Need to look here to the profound great power geostrategic competition and struggle. The U.S. national security strategy tells us that the post-Cold War era is past, it's over, and the contest is underway to shape what follows. The so-called rules-based order, a disorder that was frequently violated by the United States and its allies, was written to advantage the U.S. and to a lesser extent Western European and Japanese elites. Russia, China, and the global South were left out of the rules-making process. Over the past 75 years, with China's rise and post-colonial development in the global South, the economic, technological, diplomatic, and political foundations of U.S. global hegemony have atrophied, and new power centers demanding their share of the pie have emerged. It is impossible to know the degree to which Russian imperial ambitions, such as Boris Karglitsky has taught us about, its efforts to revitalize popular support for the Putin regime, the degree to which these two forces played roles in Putin's decision to launch the war. But it is certain that NATO's expansion exposed deep Russian security vulnerabilities that played a central role. Russia's invasion was an assault on the rules-based order, so-called, not only to ensure the security on Russia's western periphery, it was also a catalyst designed to serve as a shock to revise the global disorder. A year from now, we will see that despite Russia, Ukraine, and the West having suffered defeats and losses in this war, that the geopolitical landscape will reflect that China and sectors of the global South will emerge as winners in an increasingly multipolar world disorder. A year from now, we will have deeper understandings to how Biden's refusal to press Zelensky to engage in ceasefire and substantive peace negotiations have been counterproductive. We will also see that they have undermined rather than enhanced Washington's ability to shape the future. A year from now, we will, unfortunately, have yet deeper understandings of how the war has increased the existential threats facing humanity. Before the war, Russia and the US withdrew from the INF Treaty. Since the war began, the Open Skies Treaty has been suspended. There have been no negotiations to update and extend the New START Treaty. And as a result, there will not be enough time to revise the New START before it expires a year from now. No, before it expires. A year from now, we will understand the significance of these lost opportunities and the existential madness of Russia linking resumption of arms control negotiations to the outcome of the Ukraine war. We will be facing the prospect of an unrestrained, this is very important here, I think we'll be facing the prospect of an unrestrained nuclear arms race, analogous to that of the 1950s and 60s. And we will still be in a more desperate situation in relationship to the climate disaster that we are suffering and which will grow in the course of time ahead. We can hope that despite the bleak situation we now face, that over the next year, US, Russian, Ukrainian, and other European leaders will be able to read the writing on the wall. We can hope that popular pressures will spur the beginnings of the three integrated sets of negotiations that we so desperately need. Ukrainian and Russian, facilitated by other nations, NATO and Russian negotiations for a new and more just security architecture in Europe, and US-Russian diplomacy to restore strategic stability and renewed arms control negotiations, possibly in association with China. Here's hoping that with our efforts, that a year from now we'll have something to celebrate, or at least be able to smile at, rather than facing the situation which Heidi just described to us. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to our continuing discussion.
Thank you, Joseph. And we will come back to your position in the discussion afterwards. May I now ask Oleg Bodrov to take part and present his view from a rather Eastern perspective.
Thank you, colleagues. Just a moment. I'd like to organize demonstration of the screen. Just a moment.
So I can just refer to you as a member of the Council of the International Peace Bureau and chairman of the Public Council of the South Coast of the Gulf of Finland, Petersburg in Russia. And you are in IPB since October 22. And you are one of the leaders of the Russian peace and environmental protection and nuclear safety movement, and in coalition with the Baltic Sea countries to reduce the level of confrontation between NATO and Russia in the Baltic.
Yes, thank you, colleagues, for the introduction. And I'd like to say that I'm physicist and ecologist. Just now, I am sitting the coastline of the Baltic Sea in my house, in the biggest nuclear cluster in the northwest part of the Russia. It is close to St. Petersburg. And in the beginning, I'd like to say that for me, the war between Ukraine and Russia, it is not only conflict, military conflict between the countries, it is my personal drama, because my wife is 50% of Ukrainian. I have many friends in Ukraine, and it's pity, but it is a problem for the cooperation now with my colleagues from this country, and not only from this country. And in the beginning of my speech, I'd like to say about the current situation in Russia 2 years after the beginning of the war. The Russian authorities have made war a profitable business for citizens. Every month, all residents of our region receive a utility bill. There is an advertisement on the back of this bill that you see in my slide. There are invitations for the people who will sign the contract, military contract. This person will get 10,000 euro. And after that, after the beginning of the activity in the confrontation line with Ukraine, all this person will get 2,100 euro per month for the participation in the war. And 32,000 prisoners from the prison participated in the war in Ukraine from the Russian side. So it is illustration that the war became a profitable business for the people who live in the depressive regions of Russia. In the same time, when was election campaign for the Russian election of the Russian president, more than 150,000 Russians residents supported Boris Nadezhdin, only one candidate of the president against for the war. So it is illustration that we have civil society in Russia who want peace but not war. And now I'd like to start to say about the new challenges which is we have now after the beginning of the war. 2 years ago, Russian troops captured the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. In history, there have been cases of destruction of the nuclear and radioactive facilities. In this slide, you can see when Israel destroyed the not military research nuclear facilities in Iraq. So it was about 50 years ago, the first demonstration when military destroys the nuclear object. And next year after in the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Russian troops captured the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It is the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. And in the spent fuel rods of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant concentrated about 60 tons of plutonium. It's mean this is equivalent of the 750 millions of the lethal dose of plutonium-239. It's mean if the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia in Ukraine will destroy it, it will be problems for the whole population, not only in Ukraine, but in Europe. And in the same time, after this situation, when was captured the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, it was some military and terrorist attacked to the infrastructure of the Leningrad nuclear power plant on the coastline of the Baltic Sea, and in Kursk nuclear power plant, it is close to Ukrainian border. There are concentration of the plutonium-239 in the spent fuel rods of this nuclear power plant, 1.6 billions of lethal dose of this extremely toxic element in our planet. Maybe you know that this element practically it was known in our planet 70 years ago, before the beginning of the nuclear age. And after the operation of the nuclear power plant and the production of the nuclear weapons, we have this element, 100,000 tons of this element, and it is extremely toxic because this element not participated in the evolutionary process in our planet. And you can see the line of the military confrontation between Russia and NATO countries in the Baltic region. from the both sides, from Russian and NATO countries side, we have more than 30 nuclear power plants and spent fuel rod storages. So we have extremely dangerous situation because according to the NATO plan, which was published, NATO ready to initiate military conflict in the close to St. Petersburg or close to Leningrad nuclear power plant. I'm sure that the similar plan the Russian president have in the Baltic Sea region. It means that just now politicians are ready to initiate military conflict in the area with location too many nuclear power plants and which is have hundreds tons of plutonium. I think it is a very high level of the risk, not only for the Russia, but also for the all Baltic Sea countries, where live about 90 million people, including the Russia. I think we need to restore cooperation between NGOs in Russia and Western countries. Just now we have double iron curtain. When it was Soviet Union, it was iron curtain, which is it was a problem for the cooperation between Western countries and Soviet Union. But now we have the iron curtain from the both sides, from the Russia and from the Western countries. I think we need common projects and cooperation for the protection, not only peace in our region, but also our environment. I think reasonable if the environmental and the peace movement from the Western countries and Russia will cooperate. And in the same time, I'd like to say that we have, after the beginning of the aggression of Russia to Ukraine, the industrial aggression in Russia was like echo of the military aggression of Ukraine. After the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Australia has imposed a sanction on the supply of aluminium to Russia. Ukraine has nationalized the Mykolaiv aluminium plant. And the Russian, it is not Russian, it is international Russian-American company, Rusal, haven't any more alumina for the production on the Russian territory. And the Russian government decided to build aluminium plant on the shores of the Baltic Sea for the supporting of the Rusal company, which is controlled by American and Russian business. And this process started without any public discussions. It was only authority decisions to construct this dangerous plant close to Leningrad nuclear power plant. And just now, more than 20,000 residents of the St. Petersburg and Leningrad Oblast protest against this Russian-American plant in our region. I think it is one of the examples which is illustrate that we need to cooperate with the colleagues from the peace environmental movement from Russia and Western countries. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Oleg. So you added some more fear on the conflict, and I was told now that we don't discuss here at this point. Michelle, would you like to correct the time table?
Yeah. Thank you, Deki. Thank you to all our speakers today. We really appreciate all the questions that we received from the participants also via chat. We take note all the questions that you have for session 1. We will try to have a space for discussion at session 3, or we'll answer your questions via email. So kindly send us email at our through the IPB, and we will address the questions that being provided through this webinar session. Given also the interest of the time, we have for these webinar sessions, we have 3 sessions, and we will have, for now, we will have at least 5 minutes break before we start the second session. For the session 1, thank you to all speakers, Joseph, Heidi, and Oleg, for sharing your expertise and brilliant analysis of the current situation, especially on the topic on the session 1, on how are we going to the consequences of what's happening right now. So thank you so much to our speakers for session 1. 5 minutes break to all our audience today, and we'll start for session 2. Thank you.
Well, here we are back again. I'm sorry I wasn't able to follow session 1. I was naturally at a demonstration, because today that's what we're doing in Italy. We've got 120 events in 110 cities. I bet many of you didn't even know there were 110 cities in Italy, but there are. And we're all very individualistic in this country. We prefer to have things in our own town rather than centrally. And it's absolutely fantastic, in fact. Is everything okay, Sean? I see.
I was just expressing maybe a happy surprise on how many demonstrations there were there. Yeah.
I'll repeat that. 100. They haven't all been done. They were mostly this morning. Something was done yesterday afternoon, and the rest are going to be this afternoon. But it's great. It's very, very, very good, and a very broad network of organizations, which is the best part as well, and including institutions, many elected city councils, and also parishes and bishops' dioceses. So we have, the Pope makes a difference when he speaks about peace. Now to my task. My name is Lisa Clark. I'm the former co-president of the IPB until a year or two ago. And I'm here to introduce and moderate session 2, which is called Opportunities, Ways Out, Opportunities. That's what we're all looking for. And that's what we were talking about in the main square of Padova in front of the town council just up to half an hour ago, was how shocked we all are that there is no diplomacy, no negotiations, no important efforts at dialogue and negotiations, just talk of weapons and more weapons. And that's the wrong way around as far as the citizens of this country are concerned. I'm delighted that we're going to have our friend Anu Chenoy, as a first speaker in this session. It's a change, but it's a very welcome change. Anu is going to tell us about the Global South, and that's refreshing after all this Europe only, and Middle East, as we call it in Europe, which is in fact Western Asia, isn't it, Anu? Right. Anu, do you want to start? And I'll do some timing and things, because I understand we're very pressed for time.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Sean and friends at IPB for inviting me, and other friends who are here. Thank you for reversing this order. which is like what we used to say in the feminist movement, don't just add and stir, but mainstream. So don't just add and stir the global south, but mainstream it also. So really, if one has to, the topic given to me was the importance of the global south and finding peaceful resolutions. Now, I believe that to look at the global south and look for it for some creative resolutions, I think one has to first ask two questions, that is, or understand two questions. And one is, how is the global south framing this war? What is the context of this framing? And how do parties to the conflict see the global south and the global south position and power in the international arena? And therefore, what can the global south offer for peace? Now, as far as how is the global south framing this war, as you all know, it's very different than how the Euro-Atlantic Alliance is framing this war. And that is, if you've seen all the UN resolutions on Ukraine so far, at least in the beginning, everyone kind of, they know it's a war is illegal. They said that the Russian invasion was wrong, and they all asked for peaceful negotiation. But of course, significant numbers, including the large countries like India and South Africa and some others, abstained, as did several, substantial number of African countries. They continuously abstained, saying that they were going to be neutral. But all of them, including those who condemned the war, in their national discourses, they did say that Russia had some legitimate security concerns. And number two, they don't approve of sanctions. They've never approved for unilateral sanctions because so far it was the global south who was subject to sanctions. In the last, let's say, even 30 years of the about 86 countries of the global south, including India, have faced the US sanctions. So they oppose sanctions, and unless they're from the United Nations. And even as the global south does not speak in one voice, has no one coordinating center, they have framed this war where they see that this is a war between Russia and the US-led NATO, where Ukraine is actually a victim. And they believe that Russia's had legitimate security interests because, for example, they would not like to have NATO or missiles on their borders. I mean, like, for example, if Pakistan became part of NATO with missiles on the Indian borders, they would definitely, have a thing or two to say. So second, I think they all believe that the US does have a hegemonic agenda, and they have taken advantage of Ukraine's internal conflicts and anxieties and incapacities. And everyone in the global south is saddened, as Lisa said, about the lack of any diplomatic or even.
Anu, your mic just muted.
It was a war which need not have happened, and there were many opportunities of peace that were lost. Also, the global south, a lot of the countries have specific national interests. They have trade with Russia, which they've not stopped. 38 countries of the global south get arms from Russia, including India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, UAE, all of Central Asia, etc. They're dependent on Russian hydrocarbons in a very major way. The development of these countries who lag behind, as you know, the global south was the so-called underdeveloped. They're in the process of development. They need these resources. And moreover, they don't see Russia as a threat, unlike, sadly, that Central East Europe does, because they were never colonized by Russia. And they recall that there's a memory of Russian support to the decolonization movements. And they see a continuity of post-colonial policies which are more stark in the West than they have been in the last 20 years. There was a belief that the West was no longer as colonial or neo-colonial, but now suddenly that that aspect of the West as almost neo-colonial has come back. And of course, they see the double standards on the issues of human rights. And they've linked also, many of the countries have linked how the West has supported Israel vis-a-vis Palestine. So these are these two conflicts in which the West has a major role. So the second question, how do these parties of conflicts then see the global South? They see them as weak, as former colonies, as intellectually lacking, and they see them basically as useful resources for a continuation of Western primacy and world order. So therefore, my last kind of point is, so what is the importance of the global South in finding peaceful resolutions? I think first is listen and ask and think of why they have been neutral since World War II, since they got independence, and why they continue. And this neutrality is not really neutral as you understand it in Europe. It is non-alignment. That is, they take a position when they believe it is normative. So they are supporting, most of them, 99% are supporting the Palestinian cause. Recently, there was a meeting of the non-aligned in Kampala, Uganda, and there were very strong resolutions on Palestine. So they do take positions. They want non-militarism and support to development, even though they are militarized within. They don't want this external militarism, and because it endangers them. The polarization of the world and the possibility, and a clear possibility, of a new Cold War goes against development, against food security, against climate, environment, and the global South is the one which is going to suffer. And therefore, large number of countries of the global South have actually offered and proposed mediation. I don't know if it came in the Western press, but African countries collectively had said they would like to mediate. Brazil has offered mediation. India, even recently, in the last 2 weeks, has said that they're ready for being a mediator. But this neither comes in the Western press, and nor is it taken seriously. So really, the global South does have, it's not hegemonic. It's never been hegemonic, and it's unlikely to be hegemonic. They believe in multipolarity, and that's where they feel development for them and the rest of the world lies. And multipolarity means inclusiveness and a more democratic order. It means global disarmament and so on. So I conclude lastly by saying that I see that our work in civil society is to put pressure for ceasefire, for negotiated peace, to cut through the fog created by the dominant narratives in this war, to document and retell the truths of this war, because there's what I see sometimes in the Western press and how it is actually just a partial truth just completely shocks me, because we had the greatest faith in, Guardian and New York Times, etc. But they're not telling the full story on any of these wars, whether it's on Palestine or whether it's on Ukraine, Russia. So really, that is what civil society can do, use these alternate channels and argue for common security, for collaborative security, and oppose to exclusive military alliances, and the real and constructed threats. The real threats being the threat on climate, on poverty, on want, on fear, and the constructed threats about each other, exaggerated threats, I would say. Some of them might be there. And I believe ultimately that there is no third way possible, because there is no planet B. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anu. That was very interesting, because it's what we can see from here and what we can read from here but you put it all together in such a useful, interesting way. Thank you very much. We, of course, in Italy, I suppose it's because of the contacts we have, the ties, centuries long practically, ties. We knew a lot about Brazil's attempt at mediation. We certainly didn't know that India had recently offered to mediate. The Vatican, when the Vatican sent Cardinal Zuppi around last August, September for a couple of months, he went to, he went, of course, first to Kyiv and then to Moscow, and then he went to Washington, and then he went to Beijing, and he was sort of traveling around also trying to enlist other important countries as mediators, but eventually he gave up. And not the Pope Francis hasn't given up on peace, but there was just, he found no possibility for mediation then, but that was 7 or 8 months ago. Maybe he should try again. Our next speaker is Reiner. Dear Reiner, who was for a while my co-president at IPB. And I think Michelle can put up in the chat, can put up the full sort of bio, the short profile of Reiner, so that you can all read it. But Reiner also was the director of YALANA, the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Weapons, Nuclear Arms, for YALANA, Germany. So he has decades of experience in peace activism and political analysis to be used by the peace movements. So we're, of course, interested to hear what he has to say. Reiner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lisa, and it's great to see and hear you again. And thank you to the organizers that they changed the order of the speeches. I think it was great to start with Anu, because the speech of Anu shows for me again that the hope for peace processes, and I don't mean only Ukraine, is coming from the global south. This is the dramatic change of the power structure in the world. The NATO countries, under the leadership of the US, are only going for confrontation, for saving their power politically and economically in the world. And the power changes are coming from the global south. This includes that the hope for a peace process is mainly also coming from the global south. And when you see the suggestions which were lying on the table since 1 year or even longer, and see the actual diplomacy, including the diplomacy on the Munich Security Conference, then it were the countries of the South which are trying under very difficult conditions to push for diplomacy, negotiations, and ceasefire. And I will mention specifically one country, which from my point of view is doing a great, more or less secret, but continuation of diplomacy, that is China. China is, from my point of view, doing everything to bring the different war fighters on one table, or maybe on 2 tables in one room, or even maybe in 2 rooms. And they were promoting, again at the Munich Security Conference, the ideas of first step for negotiation, the ideas of first step of trust building. And I'm saying this in a situation where the Western countries are in a deep dilemma, from my point of view, which make it even more difficult to find a way to diplomacy. The dilemma is that on one side, Ukraine cannot win the war by power, by people's possibility, by soldiers, by weapons. Even when the West is sending more weapons, it will not work. And they cannot lose they cannot give up, and they don't want to give up their policy of confrontation. This means they were doing the same what they were doing the last years, more sanctions, which are not working, and more weapons, which make the situation even more difficult. Can you imagine what's happened when a Taurus rocket is going down over the Kremlin? What will be the answer? Then we are really absolutely near, maybe in a nuclear war. So this put again the question of diplomacy, ceasefire negotiations in the middle point of our discussions. And we have to see that in the last years, it was a lost year for diplomacy. Quite nothing happened, only some exchanges of captured soldiers and maybe the grain agreement in the Black Sea. Nothing else. But the secret diplomacy, including the diplomacy between military of Russian Federation and Ukraine, still goes on. And the former chief of the Ukrainian army underlined this again in one of the interviews. And why it is absolutely needed that we are going for diplomacy. The new figures of the war are more than dramatic. We have 700,000 killed soldiers on both sides in these 2 years. These are horrible figures. And we will lose a whole generation of young people in Ukraine and also partly in Russia, which are not able to reconstruct both of the countries. What does this mean for now? First of all, I think we have to be very realistic. There is no interest of negotiations, I have to say, on both sides. Because of the Russian side, even when it offers to negotiate, is hoping to win the war. And maybe military, they will be more successful than in the past. But they cannot win the war in total. That is from the power structure and from the power which NATO can put into the war impossible. So we have to come to negotiation and ceasefires. What does this mean for me? First of all, and I will follow Lisa, it means for me, we need a new peace initiative from the Vatican, including maybe a new international peace conference at the Vatican. Second, we need common discussions in the United Nations about the peace process. It must be more coming to the public that the majority of the countries in the world are in favor of a peace process and diplomacy and not in favor of a continuation of the war. The background that this could be successful or more successful in the past is that the support for putting more money in this war becomes smaller and smaller, not only in the United States, and I'm not speaking about Trump, I'm speaking about every president who will not give the same amount of money again like it was in the past. And I'm speaking also of the opposition in the European Union when I'm looking to Hungary, Slovakia, and other countries, including France. France is making big words, but they only spent 6 billion military support for the Ukraine. Germany was giving 57 billion of support of it. And Macron still has a political line to the Kremlin. So that brings me to the point that we as peace movement also ask for European initiative. And this European initiative for diplomacy can, from my point of view, only come from can start with 3 countries. This is France, Spain, and Germany. And the peace movements in these countries were asked to enlarge their efforts to push for these negotiations and ceasefire. Because what is the alternative? The alternative is that we are on a more bloody way, going the way of the war of Afghanistan. Endless war, maybe even an endless frozen war, but frozen and continuation of the war and of the confrontation in the world with these really unacceptable amount of military spending everywhere, which we need for the global challenges in the world. So I think as peace movement, we have to push for such a common activities of these countries. And also maybe as a request to the peace movement and all people which have fear about the war, I will say it very cautious. We have to push that the ideas of common security are again becoming more alive and becoming more accepted in the discussions of our countries. The main hegemony of our discussions in the countries is only to send more weapons, to make more sanctions, to enlarge the confrontations, the demonizing of Putin. But we have to change this to a hegemony of the discussion of common security. And this is again, not only the work of the peacemen, but also of the trade union, the churches and other social movements, but also of the trade unions. So I'm not optimistic that we will stop the war in the short term, but we have to do everything we can by actions. And neither we have not so many demonstrations in Italy, like you in Italy, but we have also a lot of demonstrations today. We have to push for negotiation and ceasefire and for the alternative common security as the alternative to confrontation and war. Thank you. Lisa, you are muted. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Thank you, Reiner. That was fantastic. And I saw someone asking in the chat whether there were many demonstrations against the war, to stop the war in other countries as well. Well, Germany, certainly. I think there's also a lot going on in France and in Spain. I think Europe is quite full of activities in this sense. I'm told that Yuri has not yet joined us. Maybe he has by now, but if not, can I ask Niamh to come on next? It's 2:28 by my watch. Niamh, would you take the floor for the next 12 minutes, please?
Yes. Hi,
And
Lisa.
the introduction, I'm sorry, I should be introducing you properly, but the full introduction will be in the chat, and Michelle will be putting it in so that everyone will be able to read it. But Niamh is from TNI. Okay.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Just double checking everyone can hear me. Yeah, I presume so. I have a button on my. Okay, I have a button on my cable that I sometimes hit off while I'm speaking, and I knock myself out. So if that happens, intervene at some point to tell me. So maybe first of all, thanks very much to everyone at IPB for organizing this and for inviting me to take part. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces that we connected with in Vienna, but yeah, it's really unfortunate that we have to be here 2 years on. We're still we're still talking about the war in Ukraine. It still goes on, and I think that everyone must be shaken with the figures that Reiner has just given us on the updated figures on the numbers that have been killed on the battlefield is absolutely horrific, and reminds us again of why we're here and why we have to double down in our efforts to call for peaceful solution. I am going to speak on the question of who makes profit from war, because I think we often forget that. So I'll get into that in a second, but also just to say, before I get into that, just to express my solidarity. I don't know if there's anyone on here from Ukraine. I know Yuri was going to join, but I think he might be involved in an event in Ukraine. But just to express my solidarity with anyone who may be on the call who's from Ukraine. And also with the peace movements in Russia and Belarus as well, who've been really active in trying to bring about peaceful solutions. I realize I'm doing this participation from the security of my own home. I'm from Ireland, but I'm based at the moment in Amsterdam, but just to recognize the efforts that others have also in calling for peace in not so easy circumstances. So to get into the nitty-gritty of what I want to talk about, it's Yeah, I suppose the complicated nature of building peace is what I was asked to discuss. And what we often look at in TNI is to do with who profits from war and the power structures that allow that sort of profiteering to take place. I think we often forget who's making money from war. Obviously, everyone on this call, we're all peace activists and we're horrified by war and the logic that drives war. But there are many who see war as a business opportunity and a way of making money. And sadly, they are very much embedded in our democratic structures. And so I'll get into that in a little while, but maybe just to mention, military spending has never been so high. The last CIPRI report from last year put it at far beyond $2 trillion US. We've never had so much money spent on militarism before. We've also never had so many instances of war and conflict, and we've also never had so many people displaced globally. And so that brings us to the question of, is nobody joining the dots between whether increased military spending is actually aimed at bringing about peace, or whether it's actually about driving war and fueling further war and lining the pockets of the people who are making money from it. And that brings us to another reflection, which we may have time to get into in the discussion about, you know, posing the question about militarism and whether it makes us safer. Of course, it does not. But this is the logic that we come up against, I think, in mainstream thinking, that militarism is made to make us safer. And obviously, we know that that's not the case. Maybe to just build a very quick timeline on how we got to a situation where we now have arms companies very much embedded in our democratic structures for decision making. Maybe starting from 2001, post 9/11, we see a dramatic shift in how war is framed on the international stage. We have, you know, the surge in this idea that you can't be, you're either with us or against us. And this kind of thinking of you can't be on the fence, or you have to be with us or against us. And this was, of course, the famous line that was put out by George Bush after the 9/11 attacks. And then I think it's important to remember 10 years later, we have a quote from Julian Assange, after all of what we know with the wars that took place and still continue to fuel massive insecurities in Iraq and Afghanistan, that the goal with Afghanistan was never to have a successful war, but to have an endless war. And Julian Assange got, he released lots of documents, as we know, and I mention him because his trial was this week, and many peace activists are also very much involved in that struggle. The role of private companies, private security, profiteering from war, that was very much honed on the US, NATO, Western powers, and how they rolled out their war strategies in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then we saw a shift in how those same companies started to become very involved in securing borders. And so we had companies who were involved in Afghanistan and Iraq holding fairs to market their wares along the border between the US and Mexico, and normalizing this idea that we would have border wars and wars on migrants, that we would militarize borders. And now we have a situation, of course, in Europe where our borders are incredibly militarized, and people who are freely moved, you know, the right to freedom of movement, the right to seek asylum, all of these things are being encroached upon. And the military industrial complex plays a huge role in that. So I think not just to speak about one particular war or one instance of war, but to look at the role that the military industrial complex and the arms companies are playing in fueling wars, in prolonging wars, in building this constant idea that we need military security to keep us safe. I want to mention specifically the European Union. There's obviously there's a myth that the European Union is a peace project. It certainly describes itself as that in all of its documents. But I think we all know that that is a myth. The European Union is not a peace project. We even have Thierry Breton, a European commissioner, who has described us as being part of the war economy at the moment. Maybe to mention a bit how we got to where we are with the European Union, and how embedded the arms companies in Europe are in designing European policies. We have the 2009 Lisbon Treaty, which we all remember very well in Ireland because we voted no, and then we were told, no, you have to vote yes, and we voted yes the second time round. But without getting into the particularities of the Irish Lisbon Treaty debate, in 2009, we set out what is the legal underpinning in the Lisbon Treaty for what goes on to build the European defence and security policy. Then we have 2013, we have the European Parliament resolution, which is considered to be the starting position on how to strengthen the defence industry. So from 2013, this is almost 10 years before the Ukraine war, the European Parliament is already designing policies to strengthen our defence industry. So often when you hear that the response of building up military structures within Europe is in response to Ukraine, this was already happening far before the Ukraine war. So this was in 2013. We have in 2015 the development of what was known as the Group of Personalities. It was a group of 16 people who were brought together representing 16. They were in their personal capacity, but they were each from different entities. And they were tasked with the idea of designing or advising the European Union on how it would develop its security policies going forward. So this group of personalities, 16 in total, 9 of whom are directly representing arms. They're either part of arms companies or arms research entities. So 9 of the 16 in the group of personalities, which is the entity that goes on to design what becomes the European security policy, are arms companies. They're involved in the arms companies. And so they advise on policies. The policies are then implemented, and then they apply for the funding that underpins those policies, and they receive that funding. So it's, I will tell you how to spend your money when you say, yes, I'll apply for that funding, and then I receive it back. So we have clear example of where there's a crisis in democracy, because was there any civil society person involved in advising the European Union on how they should spend their money? It's our money, it's public money, and yet it's being invested in private arms companies who go on to continue to make profits from it. And this has been happening for at least a decade now. If we go back to 2013, and then the group of personalities in 2015. I think we all remember the quotation from Ursula von der Leyen on the day that the Ukraine full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened 2 years ago today. Ursula von der Leyen, who tells us that the European Union and NATO are one union and one alliance. Which is, of course, hugely problematic for an Irish person because we're not a member of NATO, but it's problematic in many more ways than that. But this idea that the European Union would become so closely aligned with NATO is obviously hugely problematic for all that what NATO stands for in terms of militarism. It's a military alliance, it's a war alliance. There's a number of funds that I could get into. I probably don't have time on how Europe has developed itself since the Ukraine war the last 2 years. But there's one in particular, the Act in Support of Ammunition Production. This came into being last summer. And the idea was that it was a fund that would come about to ramp up production of ammunition that could be very quickly sent to Ukraine, and also to avail of an opportunity to replenish arms funds with arms production within Europe. It was peppered with business speak. It removed the requirement for an impact assessment. It also encouraged states to remove to derogate from labor law, environmental standards, public contracts. There was a bailout mechanism included for businesses who invested and lost out. And the only thing, and I think this is very indicative, the only concern that was mentioned in the European Parliament's briefing on this funding, the only concern that was mentioned was that the war in Ukraine would end. And I think that is very telling of the mindset of the European Union. Their concern is that the war ends, not that the war continues. Because if the war ends, the quotation, and I have it in my notes in front of me, but I'm not sure if I find it exactly, but the quotation was to do with, if the war ends, demand will drop off immediately. And this was framed as a bad thing. And this is, the fund itself was for 500 million. So it pales in comparison, I think, in terms of the money allocation to the billions that have been sent to Ukraine in other forms of military assistance. But I think that the logic and the thinking is what we need to interrogate. And the logic coming from Europe is, the concern is the war ending. I think the European Union has been, and I think Anu has rightly shown us that we're not going to get the solutions to end this war from Europe. Europe is a warmongering entity. We're coming from colonialist countries. We've seen very clearly, I think, with the genocide taking place in Gaza, we've seen very clearly the European Union has still not, with all of what we know, has still not been able to call for a ceasefire. In fact, we still haven't taken any concrete steps to stop Israel in its as a genocidal regime, even though it is on trial at the ICJ in a plausible case of genocide. So I think that it's very clear where Europe's interests lie, and they've come to the fore very clearly with what's happening at the moment in Palestine. And that takes me to opportunities, and I'll finish with this. I was very disillusioned, I think, when we met in Vienna, in a way, thinking that there wasn't really such a strong global peace movement. We were very much sidelined and marginalized. And in fact, I think since the 7th of October, and with the massive mobilizations we've seen in support of the Palestinian people, what we're seeing is a growing anti-war movement. And the people who are coming out onto the streets, who are calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, are also very much calling for a retake and a refreshing look at what is happening. Why are we going down this road to war? Why are we constantly pushing war? And we've seen very encouraging examples where movements have gone and blocked the movement of arms shipments. There's been trade unions who have refused to transport arms. We've even had a case in the Netherlands where the courts have stopped the export of arms components for the F-35s to Israel, for example. And we're seeing other similar actions taking place, which may be specific to Palestine, maybe not, but we are seeing that there is a growing movement of peace activists coming together across the globe, maybe organizing around the question of Palestine, but certainly organizing in terms of anti-war, and that has to have an impact on the ongoing war in Ukraine. I think we're also seeing the global climate movement joining the dots between the role that the military has on climate, and the fact that, you know, our time on this planet is limited if we don't change course fast, and the role that the military is having in that is really being brought home with the activism that we're seeing with the climate movements. And just maybe to pick up on one small point, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, Lisa, but tell me if I've gone over.
Don't go over too much. Another minute or two, okay?
Okay. I just one thing I wanted to mention was on the role of neutrality, because as most people on this call know, we're doing a series on the question of neutrality and the role of mediation and negotiations. Reiner and Anu picked up on this. But I suppose we have lots of positive examples where we've seen the role of mediators, the role of negotiators, who are playing a neutral line in trying to bring people to the table. Shamefully, Ireland, which is a neutral country, has not played that role in the war in Ukraine. Instead, they've jumped on the bandwagon with the European Union. But hopefully, I think Reiner mentioned the question of maybe a peace conference at the Vatican. I think the solutions to bring about peace are not going to come from the people in power. We've already seen, and that's why I started by explaining how embedded the arms companies and the arms industry is in the corridors of power. And so the movement has to come from the people, and that's why I'm ending by mentioning the anti-war movement is growing much more so now, I think, with what's happening in Palestine. But that obviously permeates through all of the attempts to have a growing anti-war movement, a growing peace movement. Yeah, so I'll stop there, and sorry for going over my time, but I hope not too much.
No, it was wonderful. Thank you so much, Niamh. Actually, if I understand the messages from Michelle correctly, Yuri has obviously had trouble joining us. So that's why I didn't stop you earlier. We don't have our fourth speaker. I wanted to pick up on a few things you said, and Reiner and Anu are still with us, and perhaps we can see how we fill up. We've only really got 5 minutes left, so we can fill it up without any trouble. I wanted to say that to comment on some of the things you said in the last part of your talk, Niamh, on the fact that there has been such a development in what you call the anti-war movement, and I would like to call the peace movement, not necessarily exactly the same thing, but the trade unions and their role has been exceptional, at least in this country, and it was not specific to Palestine. Although, of course, with Palestine, there is a whole other section of our societies, of our civil societies, that has come out alongside the peace movement fully this time, including Palestinian citizens who live here. But the trade unions started blocking shipments into Saudi Arabia in the case of the Yemen, when they were shipments that were being used to fuel the bombing of Yemen a few years ago. That happened in Italy at several ports. And that sort of signals an awareness and a wish to be part of a society that is working towards a different vision of the future, a different vision of what we really want our countries to do and to be. And the other thing that has been interesting is how cities have been active. We've been using city council resolutions for nuclear disarmament for years, and also for the reduction of military expenditure. But I just launched a few weeks ago a campaign amongst city councils for the recognition of the state of Palestine. Now, if our national government doesn't want to do this, we want the local governments to push them in that direction, to show that this is what the citizens want. And I think this is something that can be replicated and used for all sorts of different issues. And of course, peace in Ukraine and working towards negotiations and no longer shipping, just thinking that shipping weapons will solve the problem. There is no military victory to be had. And if dozens and dozens of important city councils say that out loud and vote resolutions along those lines, they cannot be totally ignored any longer. At least that's what I think. I'd like to hear what Reiner thinks about that. And then I have one other question that I want to hear from Reiner and from you, Niamh, and Anu, if you want to. But because this is something I think it's rather European, you mentioned Assange. And we had a very strange thing happen in Italy. That when Navalny died last week, there was a whole movement within the peace movement that said, we don't really care much about Navalny dying, but we want Assange out of jail. And the two things, I don't understand why we can't be in favor of the human rights, the life and the freedom from prison of both of them. Is there an explanation for this?
You know, I have many problems with Navalny has done, but I'm always in the continuation of Rosa Luxemburg for the freedom of speech, and that no one should put into the prison because he's speaking about something which I not agree. It's the opposite for me. I'm for the freedom of everyone who is opposition to my opinion. So it's a key point. It's a shame what's happened with Assange, and the Russian government is definitely responsible that he died, and that we are doing everything. I was speaking on 2 rallies to Assange freedom is absolutely important, because he is putting into the prison because of his peace work. He is one of us who was punished for saying the truth and bringing war crimes to the public. So we should do everything to get him free and to save his life. I think that is where we are now. You know, for your first question, I'm absolutely in favor to do so many things as possible at the grassroots level. And citizens are very important for the peace work. We saw this by the nuclear weapons campaign. We saw this partly by the military spending campaigns. And we see this for the climate of the society. So whenever cities and city councils are supporting peace activities and anti-war activities, including the war in Gaza, against the war in Gaza, I think this is really great, and we should promote this very much. The last sentence I want to say is I'm so happy that you have a positive report of the trade unions in Italy. I can only say the trade unions in Germany are making peace policy with the war government. Absolutely. And that's a shame. The trade unions and the leadership of the trade unions, many trade unionists not, but the leadership of the trade unions are really leaving the peace movement at that moment and supporting more or less sanctions and even partly weapons export and weapons export. We have a new documentation of the IG Metall, the biggest trade unions in the world, together with the industrial war industry, saying, yes, we need more working places for producing weapons and tanks. It is unbelievable, but this is the German trade union's reality.
That's terrible. What terrible news. What terrible news. I'm going to tell our Italian unions so that they can see what position they can take. Well, I think we've come to the end of the time allotted. I'm going to have to go anyway because I have another thing at 3 o'clock. I'm terribly sorry. We were supposed to end at 2:50, and so because of the sad fact that Yuri was not able to join us, obviously they've done something to him, poor thing, we end on time, and your next session is going to be starting in about 8 minutes, according to my clock. Well, thank you, IPB family, for organizing this. It's a very, very interesting worldwide take on what we're all trying to do together, and we can learn so much from each other, and it's also extremely nice to see old friends again. Bye all, and back here in about 7 minutes now for session 3.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
To everyone. Hello to everyone. It's very, very nice to see you again after Vienna, after our European and international activities to support the peace process and to stand up against the wars, all the wars. And today, two years after the Ukrainian invasion, in Italy, we have more than 120 cities mobilized, thousands of people on the street calling for the ceasefire and to stop all the wars. So I'm very happy to stay with you this afternoon and to strengthen our cooperation and to raise up what is the role and the civil society actions all over the Europe and in the USA too, and all the world. And I think to use in the best way the time, we can start immediately to give the floor to to our first speaker, my dear friend, mio caro amico, my dear friend Bert Knorr from USA, from I think California. Bert is a very committed person. He studied in Italy, in Bologna, my town, and he started since the Vietnam War, committed for peace, and now he's co-chair of the Peace in Ukraine coalition, an important USA coalition. And I ask to Bert to take the floor and to start our session, giving us some suggestion on what could be from this crisis can be an opportunity for our commitment to achieve peace and coexistence and justice all around the world, and starting from Ukraine, of course. Please, Bert, go ahead. Avanti, avanti, Bert.
Grazie. Sergio, it's so good to see you again since our time in Vienna together. And I want to clarify, I think I've got 10 minutes. I know Yuri's speaking too. Sean, can you confirm that I have 10 minutes? Or
yeah,
so
10
I'll try to keep
minutes.
Okay, great. So the first thing I want to say is that conditions vary in different countries, as we well know. And I'm going to be talking mainly from the experience of the United States, which doesn't necessarily apply carbon copy-wise to every country, but there's some things that we've learned and some things that we've experienced that I want to share with you that hopefully are a basis for further discussion. And just the starting point to me is the world changed in October 2023, and in a major way, in a huge way. And when I say that, I want to be clear that history did not start in October 2023, because the prevailing narrative we get is it was all because of Hamas. Every crime that is being committed by Israel with full complicity by the US is because of Hamas. And I think that unless we see this through the lens of 75 years, starting in 1948, and then 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, as well as part of Syria in the north. So anyway, I think that's an important context. And you may remember that we had a call for a global mobilization for peace in Ukraine that came out of the Vienna conference in June of last year. And that mobilization happened the first week in October. And I know in Italy, you guys had a huge demonstration or multiple demonstrations. I know there was a really big one in Rome. In the US, we had a lot of smaller actions in a number of different cities, but and a teach-in in Washington, D.C. that included some prominent people, got some attention. But by and large, we weren't able to muster the kinds of numbers to really be impactful. And I have to say that looking back at the work from February 2022, when the coalition formed, we did a bunch of stuff. I'm not sure how much impact it had, and that was in large part due to the objective situation in the US. And I'll come back to the question of the objective situation later. So anyway, we had those actions that week, which was great. We felt good about it at the time. And then that weekend, the Palestinian resistance broke out of the Gaza prison camp, and Israel launched a genocidal war on Gaza. And from that moment on, literally on October 8th, there were thousands of people that came out in San Francisco, whereas we had max 100 for around the war in Ukraine just a few days before. And what erupted, and also we saw much of the same thing in many parts of the country. There was a major demonstration in New York. And what ensued was an unprecedented movement. And I'll talk about how and why it's unprecedented in support of Palestine and against genocide. And this was a real turning point. And when I say unprecedented, people say bigger than anything since the Iraq War in terms of the US. Of course, we know February 15th, there was a huge global mobilization worldwide. against the Iraq War, which broke out, I think it broke out in March subsequently. But what I would say is this is bigger than anything in the US, at least since the Vietnam War, you know, and I lived through that period. And also it broke out very, it just erupted, you know, and the movement against the Iraq War, there was a long period of building up to where the actions were initially really small. Well, this in San Francisco and in major cities in the US, this erupted, and there were demonstrations, and even now we have demonstrations in San Francisco, major actions like 3 to 5 times a week, and a whole bunch of smaller actions that are happening. And I just want to briefly list off the kinds of actions we've had. Rallies and marches, and probably the biggest one was in Washington, D.C., two actions in Washington, D.C., 300,000 people. Stopping business as usual. This has been a big aspect of the movement that sprung up, and that includes blocking bridges. In San Francisco, we blocked the Bay Bridge was blocked for several hours. There are 78 people still facing charges. Freeways have been, and in New York City, I know they blocked 3 major tunnels and I'm sorry, 3 bridges and a tunnel in the same day. Disrupting Biden, hugely important. Wherever Biden shows up, people are confronting him and saying, why don't you call for a ceasefire? Why are you supporting genocide in Palestine? And this has had a huge effect. It's rippled up in a sense to where articles coming out about, well, this is affecting Biden's base. It may cost him the election. What about in Michigan? There's a big Muslim population there. And we have Muslim leaders, including the mayor of Dearborn, Michigan. There's an abandoned Biden movement that's arisen, and people are voting uncommitted in the Democratic Party. And the appellation Genocide Joe has firmly been affixed to Biden. There's an occupation that's gone on outside Blinken's house for weeks now, occupation of federal buildings, shutting down the port of Oakland, blocking Israeli ships, Travis Air Force Base, and also weapons makers. So, and just a little bit more about what, and there's a whole range of tactics here that we can learn from. And a lot of it is spontaneous in terms of people taking the initiative in many different ways. Art has been a big part of this, and certainly I can share a lot more of the details of this with people. And I wish I had put together a slideshow and some videos and some pictures to give you a feel, but I can refer you to some sources where you can get a feel for it. And when we say it's unprecedented, it's a question of who is out there in the streets, okay? It's not, I know many of us are veterans of the Vietnam War period, okay? And I was facing the draft when I was in Italy in 1970, actually in 1969, 70, and I actually went for a physical that I successfully flunked at a base in Italy. But anyway, one of the challenges we have is we're aging, you know, and we have to pass the baton. And I know it's something we're reflecting on consciously. How do we do that? Well, in this period, what we have is a movement of the younger generation. They are in the lead. Even within my own organization, where DSA, the chapter where Democratic Socialists of America, the chapter where it was just a few of us really single-handedly trying to get actions going. Now all kinds of people are coming forward, taking initiative, volunteering to organize for action, showing up in big numbers. So the youth component is huge. The diversity is huge. I mean, the movement we had before October of last year was a white movement. It was an old and white movement, okay? So this movement has resonated across the spectrum, and it's very diverse, lots of people of color, lots of young Arabs and young Muslims, and Black people are relating a lot to what's going on in Palestine because there's a question of white supremacy going on, in terms of, the Israelis, the Zionist state and what it's about. So anyway, and I also wanted to mention the international solidarity, which is usually important, and particularly call out South Africa and Yemen. The South Africa, the case they presented to the International Court of Justice that Israel is committing genocide was ironclad, and the International Court of Justice overwhelmingly voted that there was probable or possible genocide going on, and put forward a number of measures that Israel had to take to mitigate that. And none of them has happened, and largely because the U.S. is blocking it. The U.S. is, I have to say, Israel is a pariah state, just like South Africa was. And the U.S. is increasingly emerging as a rogue state, okay? Blocking all these resolutions for a ceasefire in the UN and continuing to send arms to Israel with or without congressional approval. So anyway, the international solidarity has been hugely important. It has had an impact on the movements in the various countries. I'm not sure where I am time-wise, but I'm going to try to wrap. So coming to today, there's a big question of how do we connect the movement for peace in Ukraine with the movement for a ceasefire and an end to arming of Israel and a stop to the siege of Gaza and the genocide. Well, in the U.S., we have a fortuitous, if horrible, connection, and that is there's a single bill that is passed the Senate and is about to go into the House, and it includes $60 billion for Ukraine, $14 billion for Israel, $2.5 billion for the Red Sea to continue to bomb Yemen, $8 billion to beef up the military for war with China, which includes aid to Taiwan and building a submarine base in Australia, and also it blocks aid to UNRWA. People know that there was an accusation, still unsubstantiated, that a handful of UNRWA workers, that's the United Nations Relief and Works Association, Alliance, I don't know what the A stands for offhand, but anyway, that goes back to 1948, that has been providing aid to the Palestinians over the years, and especially since the current siege in Gaza. The U.S. immediately withdrew funding. A number of European countries followed by withdrawing funding. And so we're not only bombing and slaughtering Palestinians and killing 10,000 children by now since the war has started. The people are being starved. They don't have water. They don't have food. They don't have medicine. And and aid is being blocked and formally blocked by this new bill that's in front of the House, which is the other House of Representatives, which is the other half of the U.S. Congress. So we issued a statement, and we're coming out and saying block the bill. And this is the first time that our coalition is taking a stand publicly against the war in Gaza in support of Palestine. And I will put a link to that statement in the chat when I have a chance, not at the moment. But it basically connects the two. It says we oppose this bill, and we're actively working against it and doing all we can to prevent it in terms of contacting members of Congress and so on. And I should say, Medea Benjamin and Code Pink have been amazing. They have been in the Senate and Congress buildings for months now, confronting senators, bird dogging them, saying, why don't you support a ceasefire? Why don't you stop the genocide? How many Palestinians need to die? And it's just been incredibly inspiring. They brought kids in there with them. They brought in Palestinians with them. Susan Sarandon was in there. And you see them chasing after these senators. Many of these senators have Israeli flags on their doors, their office doors. And many of them say, oh, well, how many have died? Well, we haven't killed enough. Blame Hamas, human shields, all of this nonsense. And it is nonsense. So anyway, just to wrap, because I think I'm getting close to my 10 minutes, and I'd be happy to go into any of this in more depth. Let's see. I think we need to, some of my takeaways are, again, the objective conditions, because what is possible has changed dramatically from what was possible before. Secondly, how do we build the connections between generations? How do we build the connections between different segments of the population? You know, we need a diverse movement, we need a young movement, and we need to break through those barriers. How do we make the connections between Ukraine and Gaza and Palestine? It's not analogous. It's not It's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but one of the things we're doing is we're calling for a ceasefire in both places, and we're calling for an end to military funding in both places. And this bill that may not make it to the floor of the House because Biden, okay, because Republicans, a number of Republicans in the House want to block it. And I can go into the details of that and the history of that. And I know there was a security conference in Munich, and the shadow of Trump is hanging over the security conference in that, in that military aid to Ukraine is at risk, okay? And so that's pretty much most of what I say tonight. There's a lot to learn in terms of all the different kinds of tactics that have been used in the movement. And it doesn't mean you need numbers of people and you need young people in order to do a lot of this stuff, especially the disruption stuff. I know that my 75-year-old body isn't as capable as it was of lying down in front of cars and blocking bridges and all of that. But I think that we need to learn from the tactics. We need to broaden our movement and make the connections. And I think one last point is that the U.S. rhetoric about the rules-based order has been shown to be a myth. You cannot support genocide. You cannot block ceasefires and block diplomatic solutions and support the slaughter of by now 30,000 Palestinians and an imminent God knows how many in Rafah, and say that you are for freedom and democracy and human rights. It makes no sense. And so that is a basis to oppose U.S. and NATO policy in Ukraine, because it's just, it's just a fabrication that this is to support democracy and freedom. And what we're told now, there's a big crescendo propaganda with the 2-year anniversary and this bill facing the House, is we're told that this is another Munich moment. Putin is Hitler and he's going to overrun Europe and we've got to stop him now, and blah, blah, blah. And there's Navalny, and there's the Russians are putting a nuclear weapon in space, and there's a new balloon floating over that we got to be worried about. They don't know where it came from, whether it came from China. So, but I guess the point here is this, what the U.S. has done with respect to Palestine has put a lie to the rhetoric that has been a basis for the war in Ukraine. So I think I'm going to wrap. I may be over my time limit. Try to cover as much ground as I could. Hopefully I didn't talk too fast, but I probably did, trying to cram everything in. And thanks again for the floor. Thanks for the chance to talk to you all. And it's so great to see Sergio and Sean and the others since June, which was very inspiring and important, experience in my life and my wife's life as well. So thanks very much. Peace, solidarity, free Palestine.
Thank you very much, Bert. Very interesting and with a lot of enthusiasm and hopeness in your contribution. But now we go very fast to give the floor to our dear friend Yuri Shevchenko. Please, Yuri, welcome to join us. We are very happy to see you again. And I remember that today in Rome there is the Congress of the no violence movement, Italian no violent movement. So I think is another very interesting coincidence for today. So please go ahead. You have 10 minutes, not like Bert. Bert has 10 minutes, big 10 minutes, not about this for you. Okay, go ahead. You are free to speak.
Thank you, Sergio, for, I am not Shevchenko. My name is Yuri Shelezhenko. I'm Executive Secretary of Ukrainian Pacifist Movement, but you flattered me because Taras Shevchenko is spiritual leader, father of Ukrainian language, and also his life story. He was conscripted to army of Russian Empire against his will, conscripted for 10 years, and Taras Shevchenko suffered many years ago from similar problem from which many people in Russia, in Belarus, and in Ukraine suffer today, from the scourge of militarism, from violence, compelling people to kill, even if this killing is contrary to their beliefs. Dear friends, greetings from Kiev to all the IPB family, and thanks to organizer for important webinar on this sad occasion of the second anniversary of Putin's criminal assault against Ukraine. It is a rare event today where people gather to discuss how to stop the war, not how to destroy the enemy. It is clear that the war is planned and budgeted for many years. People are told that the fight for survival will require sacrifices and being prepared for the worst scenarios. But people also have a right to peace, and people have a right to move towards peace, breaking the ice of fears, lies, and hatred. Peace movement is a part of human nature. It is indispensable, incorruptible, and omnipresent. It starts from listening to the voice of conscience in every sane mind. At the Munich Security Conference, President Zelensky said, "Do not ask Ukraine when the war will end. Ask yourself, why is Putin still able to continue it?" He also talked about his invention, the Ukrainian peace formula, which assumes that all sorts of security, from national to environmental to food and nuclear, should be ensured by a united war effort of the whole democratic world to provide Ukraine weapons and defeat Russia. Of course, we in the peace movement have a peace formula of another sort. Peace is not equal to war. Zelensky's commitment to democracy, declared in his peace formula, is commendable, and blame towards Russia for aggression, of course, justified. But his formula is a bit incomplete, because any war or any other sort of systemic violence is incompatible with real democracy. Political power of inclusive, peaceful dialogue, decision-making, and nonviolent life. It is a dangerous utopia to turn the whole nation into soldiers and wipe all the enemy nation out from the planet. And the fact that the enemy nation attacked you first, don't make this delusion legitimate, though of course we all understand right to self-defense. I think preferably by non-violent means. Putin is still able to continue aggression because of militarist utopia entrenched in popular superstitions worldwide, not only among his subjects and fellow dictators, but also among his rivals. I remind you that the European Court for Human Rights in 2020 allowed Putin to conscript people contrary to their conscientious objections in the case Diaghilev versus Russia. And it was a sad day of moral failure for European democracy and rule of law. Putin is able to attack Ukraine because his sovereign right to oppress and to conscript his subjects is not challenged, denied or prohibited by international law, because he is allowed to play by the rules of militarist playbook, which is on the table everywhere today. Because nationalism, militarism, and great power ambitions to control their spheres of influence became normal in international affairs. The East, notably Russia and China, and the West, including Ukraine as its part, can't achieve real security by forcing their people to fight and ignoring credible security concerns of each other and refusing to have fair and principled discussion. Peace movements are needed in democratic society precisely to remind that real peace means that people are talking instead of killing, when the people are united not to fight against the common enemy, but to work for common good. People united not to fight, but to work for common good, for peace. That peace means not killing all enemies, making even more enemies to yourself in the process until they kill you. But peace in reality means turning enemies into friends, or at least good neighbors, as it happened many times in history, and it must happen again. but you should be cautious when talking about peace and common sense to haters. I am already prosecuted, my home raided with seizure of computer and smartphone for advocating peace and conscientious objection to military service, criticizing demonized enemy image, and suggesting that tragic mistakes were made on both sides. My pacifism was considered a thought crime. There is a ideologically biased forensic linguistic conclusion, which among ignorant attacks on a pacifist worldview nonsensically claims that anti-war statement clearly condemning Russian aggression and any other war is a crime, supposedly it justifies the war. Despite two independent experts found no justification of Russian aggression in my words, by the way, published on the website of International Peace Bureau, I still could be charged in this crime punishable by 5 years of prison. 5 years. These political repressions under laughable pretext have obvious ulterior purpose to shut down peace and human rights activism of Ukrainian pacifist movement, because the militarists hate when we talk about nonviolent resistance, when we help a prisoner of conscience, Vitaly Alexeyenko, to complain and get release through the Supreme Court, when our member Andriy Vishnevetsky sued President Zelensky demanding discharge from army on the grounds of conscience, when our peace agenda for Ukraine and the world becomes a nonviolent alternative to Zelensky's peace formula. But despite all the hate and repressions, I am determined to remind the militarists that censoring pro-peace speech is not a defense of democracy, but it is an authoritarian tendency. That abducting people on the streets, ignoring their objections, not only based on conscience, but even based on health, and treating them inhumanely in military training camps, like they did in recent scandalous case of Sergei Grishin, conscripted despite his serious illness and denied of proper medical examination, who was forced to declare hunger strike, and now he is in coma because of violent attempts to make him a soldier. All of these are menaces to the component of democracy in Zelensky's peace formula. And a recent bill aimed at total military registration under threat of civil death, without exceptions to objectors, with particular purpose to force Ukrainians abroad to return and fight, or else they will be deprived of property and consular services, also is not a democratic move. Since Ukraine wants to join the European family, European governments must insist on proper legal recognition of human right to conscientious objection to military service in Ukraine. They must also provide asylum and protection for all those who can't return home because of credible threat of repressions for advocacy of peace and the right to refuse to kill. And this threat is obviously credible in Russia, Belarus, and sadly even in Ukraine. Since governments are reluctant to comply with their human rights obligations, the Object War campaign was launched and it needs support of civil society. When whole world prepares for war, pacifists prepare for peace, as we always do. Someone needs to do it seriously. Instead of self-fulfilling fear of big war, we bear in hearts and minds a self-fulfilling hope for a big changes in politics and economies, minimizing to a near zero level manifestations of violence in social life and governance, abolishing all wars, armies, weapons, and arms industries. Don't ask us how to defeat the enemy. Ask yourself, are you prepared to work for a better future without enemies, where the word enemy will be forgotten? Sorry for I've been late to conclude. I'm just from meeting of Ukrainian pacifist movement, where after heated debates we adopted the statement, with reading of which I want to conclude. It is a statement on participation of unarmed pacifist forces in implementation of the Ukrainian peace formula. Ukrainian pacifist movement, bearing in mind the formula that peace is not equal to war, supports and will implement in our activities the values of peace, democracy, and justice declared in the Ukrainian peace formula of President Zelensky. We agree with condemnation of Russian aggression, demands of withdrawal of troops, and compensations for damages. Nobody could feel safe while the war is considered normal and dictates its rules of lawlessness. We will act on the basis of belief that democratic society and democratic world must be united for common good and common security. We will resist non-violently to Russian aggression and all forms of militarism and war. We will support preservation and development of democracy. We will protect human rights and rule of law. Pacifism is a vital part of diversity of thoughts and beliefs in the democratic society. We will preserve pacifist identity, which gives hope for a better future without wars, and we will uphold our right to refuse to kill. This is the statement, and the last word. When I'm talking about nonviolent resistance, I understand it is very complicated concept. Explaining it to people, I even say that hiding in shelter is also a method of nonviolent resistance. Truth telling, spreading of hope instead of hopelessness, lies, threats, and so on. Reason, truth, love, conscience are ways to resist the darkness of war. And we must understand that Russian aggression, it is dark itself, but also it evoke dark parts of our hearts here in Ukraine. So to resist the darkness of Russian aggression, we also need to resist darkness of some instincts here at home. And resistance to darkness at home is part of preserving light and resisting to worldwide darkness brought by Russian aggression. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuri. We are with you. We are with your thinking and struggle. No violent struggle, but very, very complicated moment for all of us, to support the peace thinking in Europe and in all over the world. But time is running so fast, and now I wish we pass to another point, to make a sort of brainstorming on the civil society action, and I give the floor to Sean, Michelle, Emily, Theon, and Eskil. But please, Sean, leading this brainstorming, please.
Yes, thank you, Sergio. And we have just about half an hour here left. First, our apologies with some last-minute changes that we had to our program today. Some reordering of speakers and one or two speakers that were unable to join us. I think despite this, we've had very enlightening conversations over these 3 hours, and thank you to everyone who's been with us either for the whole time or for even one part of it. I think it will be very important as we continue to brainstorm what we can do at this point, specifically in relation to Ukraine. But as Bert has noted, this is not necessarily a movement that's dedicated just toward peace in one specific region. We have a lot on our plates at this moment, but hopefully we can take the time that's ahead of us now to together brainstorm some thoughts and ideas for strategies forward for civil society and the peace movement on a global level. Of course, if you have other comments and questions, all will be welcomed during this segment. And then finally, maybe just to say, we are recording this entire session, but I think we will now stop the recording so that we can discuss these ideas openly between us. So this will be the end of the recording, but the recording will be available online afterwards in case you missed any of the segments or in case you would like to share it and share the messages that you've heard today.